Every year, when the last leaves fall and the air turns sharp, something ancient stirs beneath the laughter of children. Candles flicker behind carved faces, shadows stretch long across the streets, and masks smile wider than the faces beneath them. It's Halloween night, the only night of the year when we invite the monsters out to play. The streets fill with ghosts and vampires, witches and werewolves, skeletons and zombies. To us, they are costumes, cheap fabric and painted plastic. But each mask, each shape that moves beneath the orange glow of porch lights is a reflection of something far older, something that once terrified entire civilizations. Because before Halloween was a game, it was a ritual, a way to confront the darkness that haunted humanity since the first fire was lit. These monsters were not born in Hollywood. They were born in hunger, disease, superstition, and the long, cold fear of winter nights when the wind howled like a dying soul. The witch, once a healer, burned for her knowledge. The vampire, born of plague and the fear of the unclean dead. The werewolf, the savage lurking inside every man. The ghost, the whisper that death isn't the end. The skeleton, the cruel truth we all carry beneath the skin. The zombie, the modern nightmare that death itself can rot and rise again. And the jack-o'-lantern, the light that keeps them all at bay. On Halloween night, they return, not as enemies, but as guests of honor. The veil between worlds grows thin, and we wear their faces to keep them from wearing ours. This is the story of Halloween's monsters, where they came from, what they meant, and why they still follow us home. Because when the lights go out and the masks come off, Halloween's monsters never truly leave. The story of Halloween, and the story of all its monsters, begins with her. She is the oldest, the most complex, the most feared, and the most tragically misunderstood of all the creatures that haunt our collective imagination. She is not a creature of the grave, nor is she a demon from a hellish otherworld. She is, and always has been, terrifyingly, undeniably human. She is the witch. Before she was a monster, before she was the cackling, green-skinned hag on a broomstick, she was a necessity. In the small, isolated, and deeply superstitious villages of the old world, she was the healer, the midwife, the herbalist, the wise woman. She was the one who knew the secret names of the plants, the one who understood the rhythms of the moon and the tides, the one who could ease a difficult birth or mix a poultice to draw the infection from a wound. She was a woman who lived at the very edge of the community, both literally and figuratively, a figure of immense power, of deep, practical knowledge, and of a profound, and often very dangerous, ambiguity. She was respected, yes, but she was also feared. Her power was not the sanctioned, patriarchal power of the priest or the king. It was an older, wilder, and more chaotic power, a power that was drawn from the earth itself, from the pre-Christian, pagan world that the church had tried so hard to conquer and to suppress. The wise woman who could heal your sick child with a carefully chosen herb was also, it was whispered, a woman who could curse your cattle with a single, hateful glance. The midwife who could safely deliver your baby into the world was also, perhaps, a woman who could steal its breath in the night. She was a figure who walked the thin and often very blurry line between the natural and the supernatural, between the healer and the hexcaster. And then the world began to change. As Europe moved into the late Middle Ages and the early modern period, a new and terrible wave of anxiety began to wash over the continent. It was an age of plague, of famine, of religious schism, of a deep and abiding fear that the world was out of control, that the forces of God were in retreat, and that the forces of Satan were on the march. And in this new and deeply paranoid world, there was no longer any room for ambiguity. There was only good, and there was evil. There was only God, and there was the devil. And the old, wise woman of the woods, with her strange pagan knowledge and her deeply suspect power, was forced to choose a side. Or rather, a side was chosen for her. The great European witch hunt had begun. It was a centuries-long period of mass hysteria, of institutionalized paranoia, of a brutal and systematic war against women. The church, and the secular authorities who served it, needed a scapegoat for all the world's ills. And they found one in the figure of the witch. The witch, the demonologists and the inquisitors told them, was not just a woman with a knowledge of herbs. She was a traitor to the human race. She was a soldier in Satan's army. She had made a pact with the devil, renouncing her baptism, selling her immortal soul in exchange for a taste of his dark and deeply destructive power. She was a member of a vast, secret, and international conspiracy of evil, a conspiracy whose sole purpose was to undermine and to destroy the Christian world from within. And so, the quiet, powerful, and often deeply respected figure of the village wise woman was transformed through a brutal and systematic campaign of propaganda and terror into a monster. Every aspect of her old life, of her old power, was twisted into a new and deeply sinister shape. Her deep knowledge of the natural world, of the herbs and the plants, was no longer seen as a source of healing. It was now seen as the source of her poisons, her potions, her magical and deeply malevolent concoctions. The great, bubbling cauldron, which she had once used to brew her herbal remedies, was now seen as a diabolical instrument, a place where she would mix her flying ointments from the fat of unbaptized babies, a place where she would brew the storms that would sink the ships at sea and the plagues that would destroy the crops in the fields. Her connection to the animal world, her familiar companions, the cat that slept by her fire, the toad that lived in her garden, the crow that sat on her roof, were no longer just animals. They were now seen as familiars, as demonic spirits in animal form, as spies and servants that the devil had given to her to help her with her evil work. The black cat, in particular, a creature that had once been revered in many cultures, was now seen as the ultimate symbol of a witch's demonic allegiance, a small, furry, and deeply malevolent devil in disguise. And her connection to the old pagan traditions, to the rhythms of the earth, was now seen as proof of her satanic worship. The old sacred festivals, the solstices and the equinoxes, were no longer seen as celebrations of the natural world. They were now seen as the times of the witches' Sabbath, the great, nocturnal and deeply orgiastic gatherings where the witches would meet, in a remote and wild place, to feast, to dance, and to worship their dark master, the devil, who would often appear to them in the form of a great, black and deeply lascivious goat. And then there was the broomstick. This, the most iconic, and perhaps the strangest of all the witches' symbols. Where did it come from? The reality is a strange and deeply hallucinogenic one. The witches of the folklore were said to have a magical, flying ointment, a psychoactive salve that they would rub onto their bodies in order to fly to the Sabbath. The historical recipes for these ointments show that they were often made from a potent and often very dangerous cocktail of hallucinogenic and poisonous plants, like belladonna, henbane, and mandrake. These were not ointments that you would want to ingest, they were poisons. And so the witches would administer them, not through the mouth, but through the parts of the body where the skin was thinnest and the absorption would be most efficient. The armpits, the tender flesh of the neck, and the mucous membranes of the genitals. And the most common and most effective tool for applying an ointment to these hard-to-reach places was a simple, common, and deeply domestic object, the broom. The flying of the witch, then, was not a physical act. It was a psychological one. It was a powerful and deeply convincing drug-induced hallucination, a psychedelic journey into a world of strange and often deeply demonic visions. The broomstick was not an airplane. It was the delivery system for a very potent and very dangerous trip. And so the modern Halloween witch was born, not from an ancient myth of a supernatural monster, but from the very real and very tragic history of the persecution of real and often very innocent women. The witch of our Halloween decorations, the old, ugly, hook-nosed hag in her black pointed hat, with her black cat, her bubbling cauldron and her flying broomstick, is a caricature, a cartoon, but she is a cartoon that is drawn from the ink of a very real and very bloody period of human history. And this European monster, this creature forged in the fires of the witch trials, would find a new and even more fertile ground for its terror in the New World. In the small, isolated, and deeply paranoid Puritan settlements of 17th century New England. The Puritans were a people who lived in a state of a constant and deeply personal state of war with the devil. They believed that they had come to this new and deeply savage land to build a city on a hill, a new Jerusalem, a perfect, God-fearing society. But they also believed that the devil had come with them, that he was here in the dark and deeply pagan forests of America, and that he was even more determined than ever to destroy their holy experiment. And in the cold and deeply anxious winter of 1692, in the small and deeply claustrophobic village of Salem, that paranoia exploded. A group of young girls began to exhibit strange and deeply disturbing behaviors. They would scream, they would have violent, convulsive fits, they would claim that they were being pinched, bitten, and tormented by invisible specters. And when the terrified adults of the village asked them who was doing this to them, the girls began to name names. They named Sarah Good, a homeless beggar. They named Sarah Osborne, an old and sickly woman who had not been to church in years. And they named Tituba, a slave from the Caribbean, a woman who came from a world of a different and deeply suspect kind of a spirituality. They named the outcasts, the vulnerable, the women who did not fit into the strict and deeply unforgiving social order of the Puritan world. And the witch hunt began. But this was a new and far more terrifying kind of a witch hunt. The witches of Salem were not just accused of cursing the cattle or of souring the milk. They were accused of a form of a supernatural and deeply spectral assault. Their accusers claimed that the witches were sending their spirits, their specters, out of their bodies to torment them, to attack them in their own homes, in their own beds. This was a crime that was impossible to disprove. How do you defend yourself against a crime that your own invisible, spectral double has committed while your physical body was asleep in your own bed? The Salem witch trials were a perfect and deeply tragic storm of genuine psychological distress. The girls were, in all likelihood, suffering from a form of convulsive ergotism from the same tainted rye bread that had fueled the werewolf panics of Europe, of adolescent, attention-seeking hysteria, and of a deep and deeply cynical manipulation by the powerful adult men of the community who used the girls' accusations to settle old scores, to seize the land of their neighbors, and to reassert their own wavering patriarchal authority. But the result was a brutal and deeply shameful episode of American history. 20 people were executed, most of them women, hanged as witches on Gallows Hill. Their bodies a stark and deeply tragic testament to the deadly power of a community that has become consumed by its own and very real demons. The Salem witch trials burned the image of the witch, the evil, Satan-worshipping and deeply malevolent witch, into the very heart of the American imagination. And it is this witch, the witch of the European witch trials, the witch of Salem, the witch who is not a healer but a heretic, not a wise woman but a monster, who has become the first and most enduring of all the great and iconic monsters of the Halloween night. When a child dresses up as a witch for Halloween, when they put on the black pointed hat and the cheap plastic hooked nose, they are not just putting on a costume, they are participating unknowingly in a long, dark, and deeply tragic history. They are wearing the face of a monster that was created not from a myth, but from the very real and very brutal persecution of thousands of innocent women. The witch is the one Halloween monster who was, for a time, terrifyingly and undeniably real. And that, perhaps, is why, after all these years, she is still the one that we fear the most. If the witch is the ancient, earthy, and deeply human heart of the Halloween darkness, then the vampire is its soul, its cold, dark, and deeply aristocratic soul. He is the monster of the castle, the creature of the coffin, the shadow that glides with a silent and predatory grace through the long, dark, and often deeply romantic night of our imagination. While the witch was born from the persecution of the real, the vampire was born from a fear that is, in many ways, even more primal. The fear of the dead who will not stay dead, and who return from the grave, not as sorrowful ghosts, but as hungry and deeply jealous predators. The creature that we think of today as the vampire, the suave, charming, and cape-wearing aristocrat with the elegant fangs and the seductive foreign accent, is a modern invention, a brilliant and deeply effective literary and cinematic creation. But to find the true, ancient, and far more gruesome heart of the vampire myth, we must travel back in time and east in geography to the dark, superstitious, and often deeply unsanitary world of medieval and post-medieval Eastern Europe. Here, in the small, isolated villages of Romania, of Serbia, of Poland, of Greece, the vampire was not a creature of romance. It was a creature of the plague, a hideous and deeply practical explanation for a world that was filled with a sudden, inexplicable, and often very messy form of death. This was the world of the Strigoi, of the Upior, of the Vrikolakas. This was the world of the original and deeply disgusting vampire. Imagine you are a peasant in a small, remote village in the 18th century Balkans. A strange, wasting sickness is moving through your community. People are growing weak, pale, their life force seemingly draining away day by day. They complain of a terrible weight on their chest at night, of suffocating nightmares. And then they begin to die one by one, often starting with the members of a single unlucky family. The local priest has no answers. The local doctor, if there is one, has no remedies. But the old women of the village, the keepers of the ancient pre-Christian law, they know what this is. They have seen it before. They whisper the dreaded word, a vampire. Someone in the village, someone who has recently died, has not stayed in their grave. They are rising at night, and they are returning to the homes of their own families to feed. But the creature that they describe, the creature that the terrified eyewitnesses claim to have seen in a fleeting moonlit glimpse, is not a handsome, charming nobleman. It is a horror of pure, visceral revulsion. It is the body of the deceased, yes. But it is a body that is hideously, unnaturally preserved. Its skin is not the pale, waxy, and decaying flesh of a normal corpse. It is a ruddy, healthy, and deeply obscene color, as if it is gorged with the life that it has stolen. Its body is bloated, swollen, its burial shroud stretched tight over its distended belly. Its hair, its fingernails, its teeth have all continued to grow in the grave, giving it a wild, feral, and deeply unkempt appearance. And its mouth, its lips, are stained a deep, dark, and glistening red, and are often smeared with the clotted, still warm blood of its most recent victim. And it is often accompanied by a foul, gagging stench, the smell of the charnel house, of stale, clotted blood, and of a body that is both rotting and yet horribly not. This was the original vampire. A walking, talking, and deeply unsanitary corpse, a shambling, biological nightmare that was less a creature of supernatural evil and more a creature of a profound and deeply terrifying, unhygienic state. It was not a seducer. It was a disease, a contagion in human form. And the response to this creature was not one of romantic fascination. It was a grim and deeply practical matter of public health. The vampire had to be found, and it had to be destroyed. This was the birth of the original and deeply gruesome vampire hunt. The men of the village, armed not with crucifixes and holy water, but with shovels, with pitchforks, with sharpened stakes of hawthorn or ash, would go to the local graveyard. They would, through a process of ritual and of terrified guesswork, identify the suspected grave. And they would perform the terrible and deeply necessary act of exhumation. And when the coffin was opened and the hideously preserved, blood-gorged corpse was revealed, they would perform the ritualistic and deeply violent act of killing the already dead. The body would be pinned to the earth with a stake through the heart. The head would be cut off with a gravedigger's spade. The mouth would be stuffed with garlic. And sometimes the entire monstrous corpse would be burned to ashes. This was not a story. This was a procedure, a desperate and deeply bloody form of a supernatural sanitation. This was the raw, brutal, and deeply physical horror that was the foundation of the vampire myth. It was a fear that was born of a very real and very visceral anxiety about the nature of death itself, about the strange and often deeply unsettling processes of bodily decomposition. And it was a fear that would remain for centuries a largely local and deeply Eastern European superstition. And then, in the late 19th century, a quiet and deeply imaginative Irish author named Bram Stoker, in the course of his research for a new Gothic horror novel, stumbled upon these old and largely forgotten folk tales. He was fascinated by the raw, primal power of the blood-drinking undead. But he knew that this crude, bloated and stinking peasant ghoul was not a monster that would terrify his sophisticated and deeply repressed Victorian audience. His monster needed to be something more. It needed to be intelligent. It needed to be aristocratic. It needed to be seductive. And so, Stoker performed a brilliant and deeply transformative act of literary alchemy. He took the raw, physical and blood-drinking body of the Eastern European vampire and he fused it with a completely different and far more sophisticated kind of a monster, the dark, brooding and deeply erotic anti-hero of the English Gothic and Romantic traditions, the figure of the Byronic hero. He stripped the vampire of its peasant rags, and he dressed it in the fine, elegant, and deeply aristocratic clothes of a nobleman. He washed the grave dirt from its face. He cleaned the clotted blood from its lips. He transformed its bloated, hideous corpse into a pale, gaunt, and strangely attractive body. And he gave it a new home, not a simple dirt grave in a village churchyard, but a vast, crumbling, and deeply romantic castle, perched on a mountaintop in a wild and exotic land. And most importantly, he gave it a mind, a brilliant, ancient, and deeply cunning mind, the mind of a warlord, of a scholar, of a master strategist. He gave it the historical name and the deep, cruel soul of the 15th century Wallachian prince, Vlad the Impaler. He created Count Dracula, and in doing so, he had created the modern vampire. Stoker's Dracula was a creature of a profound and deeply terrifying duality. He was both a monster and a man. He was a creature of a savage, animalistic hunger, but he was also a creature of a deep and deeply seductive, intellectual and erotic power. He was a monster that did not just tear out your throat in a dark alley. He was a monster that you would invite into your home, into your drawing room, and ultimately into your bed. And it is this duality, this strange and deeply unsettling fusion of horror and of romance, of the repulsive and the attractive, that is the true and enduring genius of Stoker's creation. And it is this duality that explains why the vampire, in the century that followed, became such a central and such a powerful figure in our Halloween imagination. The vampire is the perfect Halloween monster because he embodies all of our deepest and most contradictory anxieties. He is, first and foremost, a creature of a deep and deeply intimate fear of contagion. He is a walking, talking disease, a creature who spreads his curse, his bad blood, through the most intimate of all acts, the bite, the kiss, the exchange of bodily fluids. He is a monster that turns the very act of love, of desire, into an act of death, of damnation. He is a perfect and deeply terrifying symbol for an age that has always been, and continues to be, haunted by the fear of sexually transmitted diseases, from the syphilis of the Victorian era to the AIDS crisis of the 20th century, to the ever-present and often unspoken fears of our own time. He is also a creature of a deep and deeply xenophobic fear of the outsider. He is the foreigner, the immigrant, the ancient, aristocratic other, who comes to our modern, civilized, and supposedly safe world from a dark and deeply superstitious land. And he comes not to assimilate, but to conquer, to corrupt, to feed on the pure and deeply vulnerable blood of our women. He is a monster that taps into our most ancient and most ugly of all tribal fears, the fear of the stranger at the gate. But the true and most powerful reason that we have embraced the vampire, the reason that he has become the dark, romantic, and deeply alluring king of the Halloween night, is that he is not just a creature of fear. He is also a creature of desire. He is a creature of a profound and deeply seductive power. He is immortal. He is eternally young. He is wealthy. He is aristocratic. He is a creature who has broken all the rules, who lives a life of a complete and deeply unapologetic freedom. He is a creature of the night, a creature of the shadows, a creature who is not bound by the boring, mundane, and deeply restrictive rules of our own, everyday, daylight world. And he offers us a chance to join him. The vampire's bite is not just an act of death, it is an act of rebirth. It is a promise of an escape from our own boring and deeply mortal lives. It is an invitation to a world of eternal life, of eternal power, of eternal and deeply forbidden sensual pleasure. And this is the dark and deeply secret heart of our fascination with the vampire. We are not just afraid of him, we are envious of him. We are, on some deep and often deeply unacknowledged level, attracted to him. We want what he has. And this deep and often deeply contradictory desire is what has fueled the endless and often wildly different resurrections of the vampire on our screens. He has been the hideous, rat-like and deeply pestilential monster of F.W. Murnau's Nosferatu, a creature that is a pure and deeply repulsive embodiment of the old, folkloric plague ghoul. He has been the slow, hypnotic and deeply menacing foreign aristocrat of Bela Lugosi's Dracula, a creature of a pure, psychological and deeply verbal terror. He has been the tall, athletic and brutally sexual beast of Christopher Lee's Hammer horror films, a creature of a pure, physical and deeply visceral violence. And he has been the tortured, romantic and deeply sympathetic anti-hero of Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula, and of 1,000 other modern interpretations, from Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire to the glittering and deeply chaste vampires of the Twilight Saga. The vampire has been a monster, a villain, a lover, a hero. He has been a symbol of our fear of disease, of our fear of the outsider, of our fear of our own dark and deeply repressed sexual desires. And he has been a symbol of our own deep and deeply human desire for a life that will never, ever end. He is the most complex, the most adaptable, and the most deeply and profoundly human of all our monsters. And that is why, when the night of Halloween comes, when we seek to dress up, to put on a mask, to become, for a single magical night, something other than ourselves, the face that we so often choose to wear is his. Because the vampire is the ultimate and most perfect of all the Halloween masks. He is a mask that allows us to be both the victim and the villain, the terrified and the terrifying, the mortal and the immortal. He is a mask that allows us, for one brief and deeply intoxicating night, to live out our greatest fears and our most secret and most deeply cherished of all our forbidden desires. If the witch is the monster born of human cruelty, and the vampire is the monster born of human desire, then our next creature is a monster born of a far more modern and perhaps far more terrifying anxiety. It is a monster born of a deep and abiding fear of the loss of the self. A fear of a death that is not an end, but is instead a grim and deeply meaningless continuation. A death of the soul, but not of the body. This is the world of the living dead. This is the world of the zombie. The zombie is, in many ways, the youngest of all the great, iconic Halloween monsters. It does not have the ancient, classical roots of the vampire or the werewolf. It is not a creature of the dark, medieval forests of Europe. It is a monster that was born in the bright, hot, and deeply spiritual world of the Caribbean, and its original form is a far cry from the shambling, flesh-eating hordes that we know and fear today. To find the true and deeply unsettling heart of the zombie myth, we must travel to the island of Haiti. Haiti is a land of a profound and deeply resilient spirituality. It is the birthplace of voodoo, a complex and powerful syncretic religion that was forged in the crucible of the transatlantic slave trade. The enslaved peoples of West Africa, stolen from their homes and brought to the brutal sugar plantations of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, brought their gods with them. And in this new and deeply oppressive world, they cleverly and secretly disguised their ancient African deities as the Catholic saints of their masters. Voodoo was, and still is, a religion of survival, of resistance, of a deep and deeply magical connection to the world of the spirits. And in this world, a world where the line between the living and the dead is a thin and often very permeable one, the deepest, most profound fear was not of death itself. Death, in many ways, was seen as a release, a return to the spirit world, a final journey back to the ancestral homeland of Africa. The true and most terrifying fear was of what could happen after death. It was the fear of becoming a zombie. The original folkloric zombie of Haiti was not a monster. It was a victim. It was a body without a soul, a walking, breathing, and deeply tragic automaton. The legend says that a bokor, a voodoo sorcerer who served the dark spirits, could, through a powerful and deeply secret magic, steal a person's soul, their très bon ange, or their little good angel. And with the soul removed, the body could be reanimated. It would become a mindless, will-less, and deeply obedient slave. This was the true horror of the zombie. It was a supernatural reflection of the very real and very brutal horror of slavery. The ultimate terror for a people who had been stolen from their homes, who had had their names and their languages and their cultures stripped from them, who had been forced to work, without will, in the fields until they died, was the idea that even in death there was no escape. That even after you had died, your body could be stolen, reanimated, and forced to work for all eternity as a mindless slave on a phantom plantation. The zombie was the ultimate and most terrifying symbol of a complete and total and eternal loss of the self. The process of zombification was a closely guarded secret of the bokors. But in the 20th century, a Harvard-trained ethnobotanist named Wade Davis traveled to Haiti, and he claimed to have discovered the secret. The zombie powder, he said, was a complex and deeply potent neurotoxin made from a variety of natural ingredients, the most important of which was the tetrodotoxin from the pufferfish, one of the most powerful poisons on the planet. The bokor, Davis argued, would administer this powder to their victim. The poison would induce a state of complete paralysis, a death-like trance so profound that it would fool even a trained doctor. The victim would be pronounced dead. They would be buried. And then, a few days later, the bokor would return to the grave. He would dig up the corpse, and he would administer a second hallucinogenic drug, a zombie's cucumber, that would revive the victim but would leave their mind shattered, their memory erased, their will completely and utterly destroyed. They would be, for all intents and purposes, a zombie, a living, breathing, but psychologically erased human being who could now be led away and sold as a slave. Davis's theory was, and still is, deeply controversial, but it tapped into a powerful and deeply unsettling idea. The idea that the zombie was not a supernatural monster at all, that it was a product of a secret and deeply pharmacological form of a very real and very human kind of an evil. This was the zombie of the old world, a tragic, mindless, and deeply personal kind of a monster, a creature to be pitied more than to be feared. And then, in the year 1968, in a small, independent, black and white and deeply subversive horror film shot on a shoestring budget outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a young and deeply brilliant filmmaker named George A. Romero would, almost by accident, change the face of the monster forever. The film was Night of the Living Dead, and it was the birth of the modern zombie. Romero's zombies were not the product of a voodoo curse. They were not the mindless slaves of a sorcerer. The film, in its opening moments, vaguely suggests that their return is the result of radiation from a crashed space probe, a classic B-movie science fiction trope. But the why of their return is not important. What is important is the what, and what they are is a new and far more terrifying kind of an undead. They are slow, they are shambling, they are relentless, and they are hungry. But they are not hungry for souls, they are not hungry for life force. They are hungry for one thing, and one thing only: human flesh. With this single, simple, and deeply gruesome invention, Romero had created a new and terrifyingly aggressive kind of a monster. The zombie was no longer a passive victim. It was now an active predator. But it was not an intelligent predator, like the vampire. It was a mindless, instinctual, and deeply, deeply stupid one. It was a creature of a single, all-consuming, and utterly biological urge, the urge to feed. The zombie had been transformed from a symbol of slavery into a symbol of a pure, unthinking, and deeply cannibalistic hunger. But Romero's true genius was not in the creation of a single monster. It was in the creation of a horde. The true horror of Night of the Living Dead is not the individual zombie, it is the sheer, overwhelming, and seemingly endless number of them. The horror is not of being attacked by a monster, the horror is of being consumed, of being overwhelmed, of being torn apart by a mindless, unstoppable, and ever-growing crowd. The zombie apocalypse was born. And Romero, a deeply political and satirical filmmaker, knew exactly what his new monsters represented. They were a dark and deeply unflattering mirror held up to the face of modern American society. In Night of the Living Dead, the zombies are a symbol of the breakdown of that society, of the failure of all our institutions, the government, the media, the family, to deal with a crisis. The true horror of the film is not the zombies outside the isolated farmhouse. It is the humans inside the farmhouse who, in their fear, their paranoia, their racism, their sheer, stubborn stupidity, are completely unable to work together and who, in the end up destroying each other long before the zombies ever get to them. 10 years later, in his 1978 masterpiece, Dawn of the Dead, Romero would refine this satirical vision. The film's heroes are trapped, not in a farmhouse, but in a vast, empty, and deeply soulless American shopping mall. And the zombies who are drawn to the mall are not there just to feed. They are there because of a kind of a dim and deeply pathetic memory of their former lives. This was an important place in their lives, one of the characters says. And we see the zombies, shambling aimlessly through the stores, bumping into the mannequins, riding the escalators, their dead, vacant eyes staring at the endless, and now completely meaningless, products on the shelves. The zombies in Dawn of the Dead are a perfect and deeply damning metaphor for the modern American consumer. They are us, a mindless, shuffling, and eternally hungry horde, driven by a vague and deeply instinctual desire to consume. And so, the modern zombie was born, a creature that was not a creature of folklore, but a creature of a deep and deeply cynical social satire. And for the next several decades, this was the zombie that would dominate our popular culture, the slow, shambling, and deeply stupid, flesh-eating ghoul. But then, in the early 21st century, the monster began to change again. It began to get faster. In films like 28 Days Later and the remake of Dawn of the Dead, a new kind of a zombie was born. These were not the reanimated dead. These were the living, infected with a rage virus, a disease that did not kill them, but that transformed them instantly into creatures of a pure and deeply terrifying speed and aggression. These were not the slow, shambling, and almost comical zombies of the Romero films. These were fast, they were twitchy, they could run, and they were a far more immediate and far more terrifying kind of a threat. This new, faster, infected model of the zombie was a perfect monster for a new and far more anxious post-9/11 age. It was a creature that was a perfect and deeply terrifying metaphor for the new fears that were haunting our world. The fear of a global pandemic, of a biological weapon, of a disease that could spread with the speed of an airplane around the entire world in a matter of days. And it was a creature that was a perfect metaphor for the new and deeply unsettling face of terrorism. The idea of the sleeper agent, of the neighbor, the friend, the ordinary person who could, in an instant, snap and become a mindless and deeply homicidal killer. And this new, faster, and more aggressive zombie is the one that has come to dominate our modern popular culture, most famously in the global pop culture phenomenon of The Walking Dead. The zombie, in all its forms, has become the great and undisputed monster of the 21st century. But why? Why has this creature, this shambling, rotting, and often deeply stupid monster, become the one that we are most obsessed with? The answer, perhaps, is that the zombie is the most human of all our monsters. The vampire and the werewolf are creatures that are a transformation of the human. They are a human plus something else, a human plus a bat, a human plus a wolf. But the zombie is a subtraction. It is a human minus everything that makes us human. It is a human minus our intelligence, our personality, our memory, our soul. It is a walking, breathing, and deeply tragic portrait of a human being who is no longer a person. And in that, the zombie is a terrifying and deeply personal mirror. It is a reflection of all our deepest and most modern anxieties about the loss of our own individual selves. In an age of a crushing and often deeply dehumanizing corporate and consumer culture, the zombie is a symbol of conformity. It is the mindless, shuffling horde, the man in the grey flannel suit, the anonymous face in the crowd, the person who has given up their own individual identity to become a part of a larger and deeply soulless collective. In an age of a rapid and often deeply disorienting technological change, the zombie is a symbol of our own, distracted and often deeply disconnected, selves. It is the image of a person, their face bathed in the cold blue light of their phone screen, their eyes vacant, their attention consumed by the endless and deeply meaningless stream of the digital world. A person who is physically present but whose mind, whose soul, is somewhere else entirely. And in an age where we are all, now, intimately familiar with the real-world horror of a global pandemic, the zombie is the most potent and most terrifying of all our monsters. It is a symbol of our own, deep and very justified, fear of the contagion, of the sickness, of the idea that we, or our loved ones, could be transformed, against our will, into something that is both recognizable and yet completely and terrifyingly other. The zombie is the monster that is left when you strip away all the magic, all the romance, all the supernatural power. It is a monster of pure and simple and deeply biological horror. It is the horror of the body that will not stay dead, the body that is hungry, the body that is a carrier of a disease, and the body that will, in the end, inevitably fail. That is why the zombie is, perhaps, the most modern and the most human of all our Halloween monsters. Because the true horror of the zombie is not that it is a monster that is coming to get us. The true horror of the zombie is that it is a vision of what we ourselves are doomed to become. A mindless, shuffling, and purely biological machine. A body that has outlived its own conscious and deeply fragile soul. The zombie is not just death without rest, it is life without a self. And in our strange and often deeply alienating modern world, that is a fear that is more real and more present than any other. Before all the others, before the witch, before the vampire, before the zombie, there was the first and most fundamental of all our monsters. There was the ghost. He is not a creature that was invented to explain a plague or a social anxiety. He is not a monster born of a specific time or a specific place. He is a monster that was born in the very first moment that a human being died, and the ones who were left behind were forced to ask the oldest and most terrifying of all questions. Are you still here? The ghost is the simplest, the purest, and the most profoundly personal of all our fears. It is the fear that death is not a clean, neat, and final ending. It is the fear that something of us, something of our consciousness, our personality, our memory, our pain can linger. It is the fear that the past is not truly past, that the dead are not truly dead, and that they are still here, with us, in the shadows, watching, waiting, and sometimes trying to speak. The ghost is the ultimate and most enduring of all the Halloween monsters, because it is the one monster that every single one of us is, without exception, destined to one day become. The story of the ghost begins in the very dawn of human consciousness. It begins in the ancient pre-literate world of our earliest ancestors. For them, the world was not a solid, predictable, and purely physical place. It was a fluid, magical, and deeply haunted landscape. The veil between the world of the living and the world of the dead was thin, almost non-existent. The spirits of the ancestors were not distant, forgotten beings. They were a constant and very real presence in the everyday lives of the tribe. They were a source of wisdom, of guidance, of power. The shamans and the wise men would speak to them in trance-like states, seeking their advice on the hunt, on the harvest, on the fortunes of the tribe. The dead were the guardians of the family, of the bloodline. But they were also a source of a deep and often very dangerous power. An ancestor who had been forgotten, who had not been given the proper burial rites, who had been wronged in life, could become a vengeful and deeply malevolent spirit, a ghost. This was the first ghost, not a sorrowful, ethereal, and largely harmless apparition, but a powerful and often very angry ancestral spirit, a creature that had the power to curse the living, to bring sickness, to cause misfortune, to demand a reckoning from beyond the grave. And it was from this ancient and deeply practical belief in the power of the dead that the first and most important of all our Halloween traditions was born, the festival of Samhain. For the ancient Celtic peoples of Ireland and Britain, the year was divided into two great and deeply significant halves: the light half, the summer, and the dark half, the winter. And the turning point between these two halves, the night that marked the end of the harvest and the beginning of the long, cold, and often very deadly winter, was the night of Samhain on October 31st. This was not just a date on a calendar, it was a moment in time when the world itself became thin. It was the one night of the year when the veil between the world of the living and the other world, the world of the spirits, the gods, and the dead, would dissolve. And on this night, the ghosts of the dead, along with a host of other, and often far more dangerous, fairies and spirits, could walk freely, once again, in the world of men. Samhain was a night of a profound and deeply sacred chaos. It was a night of great communal bonfires, which were lit to represent the life-giving power of the sun and to act as a beacon, a guide for the friendly ancestral spirits who were returning to visit their old homes. Offerings of food and drink, a feast for the dead, would be left out to welcome and to placate these returning spirits. But the open doorway worked both ways. The night was also a time of great and very real danger. The malevolent spirits, the angry ghosts, the dark and tricky fairies of the unseelie court could also cross over on this night. And they were not coming to visit. They were coming to cause trouble, to play tricks, and sometimes to steal the souls of the living. And so, the people of the old world developed a form of a magical and deeply clever defense. They would disguise themselves. They would wear costumes, often made of animal skins and heads. They would put on masks. The purpose of this was simple: to confuse the evil spirits, to hide their own human identity, and to blend in with the ghoulish, supernatural procession that was, on this one night, the true ruler of the world. It was a form of a supernatural camouflage, a desperate and deeply creative attempt to survive a night when the world was no longer safe, no longer sane. This was the birth of the Halloween costume. And when the Christian Church, in its long and often very brutal campaign to conquer the old pagan world, came to the Celtic lands, it could not simply eradicate a festival as ancient, as powerful, and as deeply ingrained as Samhain. And so it did what it always did. It co-opted it, it Christianized it, it threw a thin and often very transparent cloak of Christian theology over the old and still very powerful pagan body. The Church created a new and deeply solemn Christian festival to be celebrated at the same time. November 1st became All Saints' Day, or All Hallows' Day, a day to honor the great and officially recognized saints of the Church. And the night before it, the night of Samhain, became All Hallows' Eve, or, as it would eventually come to be known, Halloween. The Church also created another new festival on November 2nd, All Souls' Day. This was a day to pray for the souls of the ordinary and not so saintly dead, the souls of your own departed family members who were believed to be in purgatory, a spiritual waiting room where they were being purified of their sins before they could be allowed into heaven. And on this day, the old pagan tradition of leaving food for the dead was transformed into a new and deeply Christian one. The poor would go from door to door, and they would offer to pray for the souls of a family's dead relatives. And in return, the family would give them a soul cake, a small, spiced cake, a form of a charitable and deeply spiritual payment. This was the birth of trick-or-treating, but the old fears, the old beliefs, did not go away. The ghosts were still there. The belief that on this one special night, the dead could and would return remained as powerful as ever. And then, in the 19th century, in the gaslit and deeply death-obsessed world of the Victorian era, the ghost was resurrected once more in a new and far more scientific-sounding form. This was the age of spiritualism. The spiritualist movement was born in America in 1848 with the strange and deeply mysterious case of the Fox sisters, two young girls in upstate New York who claimed to be able to communicate with the spirit of a dead man through a series of strange rapping and knocking sounds. And the movement spread like a wildfire across America and across Europe. This was an age that had seen the birth of the telegraph, of the photograph, of 100 other new and seemingly magical technologies. And if a man could send a message through an invisible electrical force across a continent, then why was it so impossible to believe that one could also send a message to the world of the dead? Spiritualism was a strange and deeply compelling fusion of old supernatural belief and new scientific language. The ghost was no longer a ghost. It was a disembodied spirit. The magic was not magic. It was a psychic force. And the communication was not a prayer. It was an experiment. And the central ritual of this new scientific religion was the séance. Imagine it. A dark Victorian parlour, the heavy velvet curtains drawn tight, the only light the dim, flickering glow of a single candle. A group of men and women dressed in their formal, black and deeply restrictive clothes are sitting around a heavy wooden table, their hands linked, their faces a mixture of intense, hopeful concentration and a deep and often very real fear. And at the head of the table sits the medium, often a young and seemingly fragile woman. She is the conduit, the telephone operator for the spirit world. She will go into a trance, her body will shake, and then the phenomena will begin. The table will begin to knock and to levitate. A ghostly disembodied hand made of a strange and deeply unsettling substance called ectoplasm will appear in the air. A musical instrument, a trumpet or a tambourine, will begin to play on its own. And a voice, a strange, whispering, and often deeply disappointing voice, will speak from the darkness, the voice of a departed loved one, offering a few simple and often deeply generic words of comfort from the Summerland of the spirit world. The Victorian séance was a piece of theatre, and it was, in most cases, a complete and often very cynical fraud, carried out by clever and often very skilled professional magicians. But it was a theatre that the people of that time desperately and deeply needed. The Victorian era was a time of a profound and deeply personal and all too common experience of death. The infant mortality rates were staggeringly high. Diseases like tuberculosis and cholera were rampant. The average life expectancy was terrifyingly short. Everyone in that dark Victorian parlour had lost someone. A child, a spouse, a parent. And the séance, as fraudulent as it may have been, offered them a single and deeply precious thing, a hope that their loved ones were not gone forever, a hope that they were in a better place, and a hope that just for a moment they could speak to them one last time. And it is this ghost, the ghost of the Victorian séance, the ghost that is not a monster, but a lost and deeply beloved family member that has in many ways become the dominant ghost of our own modern Halloween imagination. The ghost is no longer a creature to be feared, it is a creature to be sought, a mystery to be solved. We no longer wear masks to hide from the ghosts, we now actively hunt for them. We have our own new and deeply technological forms of the séance. We have the ghost hunters of the reality television shows with their EMF meters and their thermal cameras, wandering through the dark abandoned asylums and the haunted historic houses, searching for a single, anomalous, and deeply ambiguous piece of evidence. We have the urban legends, the new modern ghost stories that we tell each other, not around a campfire, but on the internet. The story of the ghostly, vanishing hitchhiker, the story of the killer with a hook for a hand who terrorizes the teenagers on Lover's Lane, the story of the call that is coming from inside the house. And we have our new and deeply strange digital ghosts, the strange orb-like anomalies that appear in our digital photographs, the strange disembodied voices that are captured as electronic voice phenomena, or EVPs, in the white noise of our audio recorders. The strange and deeply unsettling stories of the slender man, a creature that was born not in an ancient oral folklore, but in a modern and deeply collaborative online forum, a ghost that was literally created by the internet. The ghost has adapted. It has survived. It has followed us from the ancient firelit world of Samoin to the gaslit and deeply hopeful world of the Victorian séance, and into the cold, blue, and deeply uncertain light of our own digital age. And why? Why do we still love ghost stories? Why do we still, in our modern, rational world, feel that delicious and deeply satisfying shiver of fear when we hear a strange noise in the house at night? Because the ghost is the most personal and the most intimate of all our monsters. The witch, the vampire, the werewolf. These are all creatures that are a transformation of the human. They are a human, plus something else. But the ghost is a subtraction. It is a human minus the body. It is the raw, unfiltered, and deeply persistent essence of a human personality, a memory, a story, that has somehow, against all the laws of biology and physics, managed to survive the death of its own physical container. And in that, the ghost is a profound and deeply powerful symbol of hope. It is the one monster that tells us that the story does not, in fact, end. It is a promise, a whisper from the darkness that says that death is not a final, absolute, and meaningless silence. It is just a change of state, a turning of a page. And that is why, on Halloween night, the night when the veil between the worlds is still, on some deep and deeply ancient level, believed to be at its thinnest, we still gather around our own modern campfires, whether they be a real fire in the backyard or the cold, blue, and deeply communal fire of a movie screen. And we tell ghost stories. We do it to feel a sense of a shared and deeply human community in the face of the one great and final mystery that we will all, one day, have to face alone. We tell ghost stories to feel afraid, yes, but we also tell them, in a strange and deeply paradoxical way, to feel a little less alone and a little less afraid of the one great and final ghost story that is, and always will be, our own. There is a final, and perhaps most honest of all the Halloween monsters, a creature that is not a product of a complex cultural anxiety, not a symbol of a forbidden desire, not a ghost of a forgotten tragedy. This is the monster that is left when you strip away all the stories, all the myths, all the psychological complexities. This is the monster that is left when you are left with nothing. It is the raw, brutal, and undeniable truth that lies beneath our own warm and deeply temporary skin. It is the skeleton, and it is the great and terrible king that wears its form, the Grim Reaper. The skeleton is the oldest and most universal of all our symbols for death. It is a symbol that requires no translation. It is a piece of art that was not created by a human hand, but by the slow, patient, and deeply indifferent work of time and decay itself. To look upon a human skeleton is to look upon a piece of our own future and utterly unavoidable anatomy. It is the ultimate and most personal of all the memento mori, the reminders of death. For centuries, the skeleton was just that, a symbol, a static and largely passive image. It was the skull that sat on the desk of the philosopher, a quiet and deeply intellectual reminder of the vanity of all human knowledge. It was the bones that were piously and often beautifully arranged in the catacombs and the ossuaries of the great European churches, a testament to the Christian belief in the resurrection of the body. The skeleton was a symbol of what came after death, a state of being, a final and deeply peaceful form. And then, the Black Death came, and the skeleton stood up. The Great Plague of the mid-14th century was a horror that was so profound, so all-consuming, so utterly apocalyptic that it shattered the old, comfortable relationship between the living and the dead. Death was no longer a distant and orderly theological concept. It was a physical and deeply disgusting reality that was piling up, literally, in the streets. The sheer, overwhelming number of the dead made the old, respectful, and deeply individual rituals of burial an impossible luxury. There was no time for funerals. There was no room in the consecrated ground of the churchyards. The bodies were collected in their thousands, and they were thrown into great, open, and deeply unsanitary plague pits outside the city walls. And here, in these vast, open-air laboratories of decay, the people of the medieval world were given a new and deeply accelerated education in the science of human decomposition. They saw with their own horrified eyes the process that had once been hidden respectfully beneath the earth. They saw the bodies bloat and turn black, and then they saw them begin to come apart, the flesh and the organs consumed by the worms and the rats and the slow, relentless work of nature, until all that was left was the raw, white, and strangely clean architecture of the bone. The skeleton was no longer a distant philosophical concept. It was a part of the landscape. It was a part of the air they breathed. And in the traumatized and deeply feverish imagination of the survivors, this static, passive symbol of the end was given a new and deeply terrifying life. The skeleton was no longer just the result of death. It was now the cause of it. It was given a cloak, it was given a tool, and it was given a job. The Grim Reaper, the great, active, and deeply personified skeleton, was born. He was a monster that was a perfect and deeply honest reflection of the new and deeply brutal world that the plague had created. This was a world where death was no longer a personal or a meaningful event. It was a mass and deeply anonymous harvest. And so, the Reaper was not a personal assassin. He was a farmer, a harvester of souls. His great and iconic weapon was the scythe, a tool that every single person in that largely agrarian society would have instantly and chillingly understood. The scythe was a symbol of an absolute and deeply terrifying impartiality. The reaper in the field does not choose which stalks of wheat to cut and which to leave. He cuts them all. The young, the old, the strong, the weak. All are equal before the sweeping, whispering, and utterly indifferent arc of his blade. And so it was with the plague, and so it was with the new and far more terrifying god of death that the plague had created. The Reaper was a creature of a pure and deeply bureaucratic efficiency. He was not a creature of passion, of rage, of a malevolent and deeply personal evil. He was a functionary. He was simply doing a job. He was the embodiment of a new and deeply modern kind of a horror, the horror of a cold, impersonal, and deeply uncaring system. And as the image of the Reaper began to spread in the art, in the literature, in the terrified imagination of the post-plague world, he began to acquire other, equally powerful symbols. He was given an hourglass, a deeply personal and deeply terrifying reminder of the finite and relentlessly draining nature of an individual human life. He was given a black, hooded cloak, a garment that was both the color of mourning and the color of the great, empty, and starless void that he had come to deliver you to. And he was given a face, or rather, a lack of one. The skull of the Grim Reaper is the ultimate and most terrifying of all masks. It is a face that is also a mirror. It is a blank, white, and bony screen onto which we are forced to project our own deepest and most personal fears of what our own final end will look like. The Reaper wears no face because he wears every face. This was the new and deeply terrifying king of the Halloween night, a monster that was not born of a myth or of a legend, but of a deep and very real and very bloody historical trauma. And it was from this central and deeply powerful image of the reanimated skeleton that a whole, new, and often deeply comical subgenre of the Halloween monster was born: the dancing skeleton. In the wake of the Black Death, a new and deeply morbid artistic obsession swept across Europe. This was the danse macabre, the dance of death. It was a way for a traumatized society to try and process, and perhaps even to laugh at, the overwhelming and ever-present reality of their own mortality. The murals and the woodcuts of the danse macabre depicted a great, chaotic, and deeply democratic procession. A line of all the different members of society, from the Pope to the peasant, each one being led in a wild and often very gleeful dance by a cavorting and deeply mocking, animated skeleton. The message was simple, and it was deeply subversive. Death comes for everyone. And he comes, not with a sorrowful, solemn face, but with a grin and with a dance. And in the centuries that followed, this image of the dancing, laughing, and often deeply mischievous skeleton became a staple of our Halloween iconography. He is the skeleton that hangs on our door, his bones rattling in the wind. He is the comical, singing and dancing skeleton of 100 different family-friendly Halloween specials. He is a monster that has been stripped of his true existential terror and has been turned into a safe and often very funny symbol of a spookiness that is no longer truly scary. But the original and far more terrifying image of the Reaper has never, ever truly gone away. He is still there in the shadows of our imagination, a silent and deeply patient figure. He is the monster that represents not a momentary spooky thrill, but a deep and abiding and truly existential fear. Because the skeleton and the Grim Reaper are the one single Halloween monster that is not a metaphor. The witch is a metaphor for the fear of the powerful, outcast woman. The vampire is a metaphor for the fear of disease, of the foreigner, of our own forbidden sexual desires. The zombie is a metaphor for the fear of the loss of the self, of conformity, of a mindless consumerism. But the skeleton is not a metaphor. It is a fact. It is a piece of your own personal and deeply unavoidable future. And that is why, in the end, it is the most terrifying of them all. The other monsters are a story that we tell ourselves about a danger that might come. The Grim Reaper is a story that we tell ourselves about a danger that will. You will, in all likelihood, never be eaten by a zombie, or bitten by a vampire, or cursed by a witch. But you will, with an absolute and an unshakable certainty, one day become a skeleton. And so, the image of the skeleton and of the great and terrible Reaper who wears its form has become the universal and most enduring of all the symbols of Halloween. He is the king of this one, single night, because he is a king who rules over all the nights and all the days of our lives. He is the true and the final and the most honest of all our monsters. He is a reminder that Halloween, at its core, is not a celebration of a childish and deeply commercialized spookiness. It is a festival of the dead. It is a modern and often very strange and very secular version of the ancient and deeply sacred rituals of Samhain and of All Souls' Day. It is the one night of the year when we, as a culture, have given ourselves permission to look directly into the face of our own deepest and most profound of all fears. The fear of our own inevitable and deeply personal end. And the face that we have chosen to give that fear is the face of a skull. A grinning, empty, and deeply and profoundly honest face. The face of the monster that is not a monster at all. The face of the monster that is, in the end, just us. Stripped of everything but the final and deeply beautiful and deeply terrifying truth of the bone. There is a light that shines in the darkness of the Halloween night. It is not the cold, pale light of the moon, nor is it the warm, welcoming light of a candle in a window. It is a strange and deeply unsettling light, a flickering, demonic, and almost living glow that seems to emanate from a hideous, grinning face, a face that has been carved with a strange and almost loving cruelty into the flesh of a hollowed-out gourd. This is the light of the jack-o'-lantern, and it is perhaps the most mysterious, the most iconic, and the most deeply and truly folkloric of all the great and terrifying symbols of Halloween. The jack-o'-lantern is not a monster that will chase you or bite you or tear you limb from limb. It is a quiet and a deeply stationary monster. It is a sentinel, a guardian, a silent, fiery head that sits on the doorstep, a strange and deeply ambiguous beacon in the night. And the story of how it came to be, the story of the man whose damned and restless soul is said to still be trapped inside that flickering orange glow, is a journey into the very heart of the old, dark, and deeply mischievous world of Irish folklore. The story begins, as so many of the great, old stories do, with a man named Jack. But this was not a good man. This was not a hero. The stories call him Stingy Jack. He was a drunkard, a trickster, a liar, a manipulator, a man of such a profound and unapologetic wickedness, and of such a clever, silver-tongued wit, that he was famous throughout all of Ireland for being a man who could and would try to outsmart the devil himself. And one night, in a dark and smoky tavern, he got his chance. As Jack was drinking his ill-gotten gains, a dark and deeply menacing stranger appeared beside him. It was the devil who had come, at last, to claim the soul of this notoriously sinful man. But Jack, even in the face of his own damnation, was not afraid. He was a gambler, and he saw an opportunity. He agreed to go with the devil, but he made one final, simple request. Could he have one last drink to fortify his soul for the journey to hell? The devil, perhaps amused by the man's audacity, agreed, but Jack, of course, had no money. "No matter," he said to the devil, with a sly, conspiratorial wink. "You are a creature of great power. You can change your shape. Why don't you turn yourself into a silver coin, and I will use it to pay the bartender, and then, once he has gone, you can change back, and we will be on our way." The devil, intrigued by this strange and deeply human game of deception, agreed. He transformed himself into a single, shining, silver coin. And the moment he did, Jack snatched the coin from the table, and he shoved it, not into the hand of the bartender, but into his own, worn leather purse. And inside that purse, Jack, a good and deeply superstitious Irish Catholic for all his sins, always kept a small, silver crucifix. The devil was trapped. The holy power of the crucifix rendered him powerless. He could not change back. He was a prisoner in the form of a single, useless coin in the dirty and deeply unholy purse of a drunken Irish trickster. He raged, he threatened, he promised eternal torments, but Jack just laughed, and he made the devil a deal. He would let him go, but only if the devil would promise to not claim his soul for another 10 years. The devil, humiliated and furious, had no choice. He agreed, and Jack released him. 10 years later, to the day, Jack was walking down a lonely country road, and the devil appeared before him again. This time, there would be no tricks. It was time to pay his debt. But Jack, once again, was ready. "I will come with you," he said, "but I am terribly hungry. Before we go, could you do me one small kindness? Could you climb that apple tree and fetch me a single sweet apple to be my last earthly meal?" The devil, perhaps forgetting the kind of man he was dealing with, or perhaps just eager to get the whole, humiliating affair over with, agreed. He climbed up into the branches of the apple tree, and the moment he was at the very top, Jack quickly took out his knife, and he carved the sign of the cross into the bark of the tree, all the way around the trunk. The devil was trapped again. He could not climb down past the holy and deeply powerful symbol of the cross. He was a prisoner, perched at the top of an apple tree, mocked by the one single mortal man who had ever managed to outsmart him, not once, but twice. But a man's life, no matter how clever he is still just a finite amount of sand in an hourglass. And eventually, Jack's time ran out. He died, and his soul, still stained with a lifetime of sin, made its way to the great and deeply pearlescent gates of heaven. But St. Peter, the great and deeply unimpressed gatekeeper, took one look at the record of Jack's selfish, drunken, and deceitful life, and he refused him entry. There was, he said, no room in heaven for a man like him. So Jack, disappointed but not entirely surprised, turned, and he made his way down, down, down to the fiery and deeply familiar gates of hell. And there he was met by the devil himself. But the devil, his eyes still burning with the memory of his own deep humiliation, just shook his head. "A promise," he said, his voice a dry and deeply satisfied hiss, "is a promise. I swore that I would never claim your soul for hell, and I am a being of my word. You cannot come in." And so Jack was trapped. He was a soul that had been rejected by both heaven and hell. He was an eternal and deeply lonely outcast, doomed to wander forever in the great, dark and cold, empty space between the worlds. "But where will I go?" Jack cried, the first true note of fear now entering his voice. "It is so dark. I cannot see my way." And the devil, in a single, final, and deeply ironic act of a cruel and terrible pity, reached into the fires of hell, and he plucked out a single, eternally burning and never consuming ember, and he gave it to Jack. "Take this," he said, "to light your way." And Jack, who had just finished eating a turnip that he had been carrying in his pocket, a stolen turnip, of course, quickly hollowed it out, and he placed the devil's ember inside. And with this small, grotesque, and deeply unholy lantern in his hand, this Jack of the Lantern, he began his long, slow, and eternal walk, a lonely and deeply cursed ghost, forever wandering the dark and empty roads of the world. This was the original jack-o'-lantern, not a symbol of a happy harvest festival. but a symbol of a damned and eternally restless soul. A soul that was so wicked it had been rejected even by hell itself. And this story, this powerful and deeply moralistic Irish folktale, travelled with the Irish immigrants who fled the great and deeply tragic potato famine of the 1840s and 50s. They brought their stories, their beliefs, and their Halloween traditions with them to their new and often very unwelcoming home in America. And they brought with them the tradition of the jack-o'-lantern. In Ireland, on the night of Samhain, on Halloween, the people would carve their own protective lanterns. They would take a large and often very gnarled turnip or a potato or a beet, and they would hollow it out, and they would carve a grotesque and often very frightening face into its flesh, and they would place a small candle or a burning ember inside. These were not decorations. They were weapons. They were a form of a magical and deeply personal kind of a home security system. These little, glowing and monstrous faces were designed for two very specific purposes. First, they were meant to ward off the evil spirits that were said to be wandering the earth on that one magical night. The grotesque face of the lantern was a kind of a spiritual scarecrow designed to frighten away the ghouls, the goblins, and the dark, and often very dangerous fairies of the unseelie court. And second, and perhaps more importantly, they were designed to represent the soul of a dead ancestor, a way of lighting a path for the friendly and deeply welcome spirits of their own, departed family members who were also believed to be returning on that night for a brief and deeply cherished visit. But when the Irish immigrants arrived in America, they found a new land, a land of a new and deeply abundant kind of a harvest. And they found a new and far superior kind of a canvas for their ancient and deeply creative folk art. They found the pumpkin. The pumpkin was a native of the New World. It was larger, it was softer, it was easier to carve than the hard and often very small turnips and potatoes of their homeland. And it was a deep and deeply symbolic shade of orange, the very color of the autumn harvest itself. And so, in a perfect and deeply American act of a cultural adaptation, the turnip was abandoned and the pumpkin was embraced. And the jack-o'-lantern, in its new and far more spectacular American form, began to spread. It was no longer just an Irish tradition. It was adopted by all the different cultures of the great American melting pot. And as it spread, its meaning began to change. It was no longer just a weapon against the evil spirits. It was a decoration, a symbol of the harvest, a piece of a fun and largely secular children's holiday. The deep and often very dark and very real pagan and folkloric roots of the tradition were, for the most part, forgotten. The story of Stingy Jack, of the damned and eternally wandering soul, was replaced by a simpler and far more cheerful story of a happy, grinning pumpkin face. And yet, even in our modern and deeply commercialized version of the jack-o'-lantern, a faint and deeply powerful echo of its old and far more terrifying meaning still remains. The jack-o'-lantern is still a creature of a profound and deeply unsettling duality. It is both a protection and it is an invitation. The light inside the pumpkin is a welcoming beacon, a signal to the trick-or-treaters, to the community, that this is a house that is participating in the strange and deeply magical ritual of the night. It is a sign that says, we are friendly, we have candy, but the face that we carve into that pumpkin is almost always a monstrous one, a grotesque and often deeply demonic grin. And that face is a warning, it is a ward. It is a silent and deeply ancient magical symbol that is designed to frighten away the things that are, on this one special night, also walking in the dark, the real things, the things that are not just children in costumes. The jack-o'-lantern is the perfect and most enduring symbol of the strange and deeply contradictory nature of Halloween itself. A night that is both a celebration of community and a deep and deeply personal confrontation with our own most ancient fears of the darkness and of the dead. It is a light in the dark. But it is a light that wears the face of a demon, and it is a silent and deeply powerful reminder that on this one single night of the year, the line between the friendly and the frightening, between the welcome and the unwelcome, between the world of the living and the world of the dead, is a very, very thin and very, very fragile line indeed. The old monsters were dying. At the dawn of the 20th century, the ancient and terrifying creatures of the folk tradition were in a state of a slow and seemingly terminal decline. The witch, the vampire, the ghost, the werewolf. These were the fading, anachronistic phantoms of a pre-industrial, pre-scientific, and pre-literate world. They were the creatures of the village, of the isolated farmhouse, of the oral tradition. And in the bright, new, and relentlessly modern world of the city, of the factory, of the electric light, they seemed to have no place. They were becoming, like the old gods they had once walked beside, mere curiosities, dusty, forgotten relics in the museum of a superstitious past. And then, a new kind of magic was born. A magic that was more powerful, more seductive, and more universally accessible than any of the old, dark spells of the grimoires. It was a magic that was born, not in the forest, but in a dark room. A magic that was made of nothing but light and shadow. A magic that could resurrect the dead, that could give a face to the faceless, and that could broadcast a single, unified nightmare into the minds of millions of people all at once. This was the magic of the cinema, and it was in the dark and deeply creative laboratories of the early Hollywood dream factory that the old, dying monsters of Europe would be given a new and far more powerful kind of an immortality. The monster makers had arrived, and they were about to build a new and far more terrifying pantheon. The great and undisputed architect of this monstrous resurrection was a small, and at the time relatively minor, film studio called Universal Pictures. In the 1920s and 30s, a period of great global anxiety, of economic depression, and of the rising dark shadow of fascism in Europe, Universal, led by the visionary and deeply eccentric German immigrant producer Carl Laemmle Jr., made a gamble. They gambled that a world that was living in a state of a very real and very modern fear would pay to be frightened by the old, romantic, and safely distant horrors of the Gothic past. And they were right. Their first great and deeply influential creations were The Vampire and the Mad Scientist. With Todd Browning's Dracula in 1931 and James Whale's Frankenstein in the same year, Universal did more than just adapt two classic Gothic novels. They created a visual language, they created an atmosphere, they created a look. The stark black and white German expressionist-influenced cinematography, the crumbling, cobweb-draped and deeply atmospheric sets, the slow, deliberate, and almost dreamlike pacing. This was the birth of the classic Hollywood horror film. And at the heart of these films were the monsters themselves, brought to life by two brilliant and deeply unforgettable character actors. Bela Lugosi's Dracula was a creature of a cold, aristocratic, and deeply verbal menace. Boris Karloff's Frankenstein's monster was a creature of a profound and deeply tragic physical pathos. These were not just men in makeup, they were archetypes. They were the new and definitive faces of their respective myths. The old folkloric versions of the vampire and the reanimated corpse were, in a single cinematic instant, rendered obsolete. The Hollywood versions were now the real ones. And the success of these two films opened the floodgates. Universal realized that they had not just created two successful movies, they had created a universe. A shared and deeply profitable universe of gods and monsters. And for the next decade, they would systematically, and with a brilliant, almost industrial efficiency, build out that universe. In 1932, they resurrected the ancient Egyptian terror of the mummy, with Boris Karloff once again playing the monster, this time as a slow, shuffling, and deeply sorrowful creature, a monster driven not by a hunger for blood, but by a desperate and deeply romantic longing for his lost ancient love. In 1941, they took the scattered and deeply contradictory folklore of the werewolf, and they codified it. They gave it a new and deeply tragic set of rules, and they created the definitive, modern, and deeply sympathetic Wolfman, a monster whose true horror was not in the beast he became, but in the good man he ceased to be. Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the mummy, the Wolfman. This was the holy quadrinity of the Universal monsters, and they were soon joined by others, the Invisible Man, the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Phantom of the Opera. Universal had not just made a series of movies, they had built a pantheon. And these new, American-made and deeply cinematic monsters would become the new and undisputed royal family of the Halloween night. The impact of these films on the still young and largely unformed American tradition of Halloween cannot be overstated. Before the Universal monsters, the Halloween costume was a largely homemade and deeply chaotic affair. Children would dress up as generic folkloric figures, ghosts, witches, skeletons, devils. But now they had specific and deeply iconic characters to emulate. You could now be not just a vampire but Dracula with the slicked back hair and the high-collared cape. You could be not just a reanimated corpse but Frankenstein's monster with the flat-topped head, the neck bolts and the stiff, lumbering gait. The Universal monsters gave the Halloween costume a new and deeply powerful sense of a shared and deeply cinematic vocabulary. They were the first, great, and officially licensed Halloween superstars. But the true and most profound transformation of Halloween from a small and largely private folk tradition into the great and deeply commercial national holiday that we know today would happen in the years after the Second World War. And it would be driven not by the movie studios, but by a new and far more pervasive set of monster makers. The post-war era in America was a time of an unprecedented and almost explosive prosperity. It was the birth of the suburb, of the baby boom, of a new and deeply powerful consumer culture. And the holiday of Halloween, with its traditions of costumes, of parties, of giving out treats, was a perfect and largely untapped market for this new and deeply hungry consumer economy. The first and most important of these new monster makers were the candy companies. The old tradition of trick-or-treating had been a deeply unpredictable and often very messy affair. Children would be given a variety of homemade treats, soul cakes, cookies, fruits, nuts, even coins. But in the new and increasingly paranoid post-war world, a world of a growing and often deeply irrational fear of strangers, the idea of taking a homemade unwrapped treat from a neighbor began to seem dangerous. Urban legends began to spread, the terrifying and almost entirely baseless stories of the razor blade in the apple, of the poison in the homemade popcorn ball. And the candy companies, in a stroke of pure commercial genius, saw an opportunity. They began to market their own individually wrapped, mass-produced and safe candies as the perfect and only acceptable Halloween treat. And they began to use the images of the classic and now deeply beloved Universal monsters to sell their products. You could now eat a Frankenstein-shaped chocolate bar or a Dracula-themed lollipop. The monsters were no longer just a source of fear, they were now a source of sugar. They had been transformed from creatures of the night into brand ambassadors. At the same time, the rise of a new and even more powerful medium, the television, was completing the process of domesticating the monsters. In the 1960s, a new kind of a monster-themed television show became a cultural phenomenon. Shows like The Addams Family and The Munsters took the old Gothic archetypes of the haunted house and the monstrous family, and they turned them into a sitcom. The monsters were no longer a threat. They were your friendly and deeply eccentric next-door neighbors. Frankenstein's monster, in the form of the gentle and deeply lovable Herman Munster, was now a working-class suburban dad who just happened to look like a reanimated corpse. Dracula, in the form of the suave and deeply comical Grandpa Munster, was a cranky but ultimately harmless old man who liked to sleep in a coffin. These shows were a profound and deeply influential act of a cultural defanging. They took the last, lingering traces of a genuine primal terror from the old Gothic monsters, and they replaced it with a safe and deeply comforting sense of a nostalgic and deeply funny spookiness. The monsters had been officially and permanently welcomed into the American living room. And finally, the rise of the post-war mass production economy created a new and deeply profitable industry, the Halloween costume industry. The old homemade costumes of the past were replaced by a new and far more convenient alternative, the cheap, mass-produced and officially licensed boxed costume. A child could now go to the local department store and they could buy a thin, plastic and often deeply inaccurate mask of their favorite monster, a flimsy vinyl smock with a picture of the monster printed on it. and a bright orange plastic pumpkin for collecting their candy. Halloween had become a product, a complete and deeply commercialized package of candy, of costumes, of television specials, of plastic decorations, a monster industry. And the old, dark, and often deeply spiritual meaning of the holiday had been, for the most part, completely and utterly forgotten. The night when the dead were said to walk the earth had been transformed into the one night of the year when the candy and the costume companies could be assured of a massive and deeply profitable spike in their quarterly earnings. And so the modern Halloween pantheon was complete. It was a strange and deeply American and deeply commercial hybrid. At its heart were the great and now largely declawed Gothic monsters of the Universal films: Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, the Wolfman. They were the founding fathers, the Mount Rushmore of the Halloween night, and they were joined by the older, more primal and deeply folkloric figures of the witch, the ghost, and the skeleton. This was the new and officially sanctioned team of Halloween monsters. A team that had been created not by a single, coherent mythology, but by a chaotic and often deeply cynical process of cultural appropriation, of literary invention, of cinematic genius, and of a relentless and deeply effective commercial marketing. The monster makers of the 20th century had not just resurrected the old monsters, they had rebuilt them. They had given them a new and deeply American set of faces, and in doing so, they had performed a final and deeply strange act of magic. They had taken a collection of creatures that were born of a genuine and often very personal terror, and they had transformed them into the safe, familiar, and deeply beloved mascots of our most favorite and most profitable of all our modern secular holidays. The monsters were no longer a threat to be feared. They were now a part of the family. A very strange, very old, and very, very marketable part of the family. The real magic, it seemed, was not in the vampire's bite or the witch's spell. It was in the power of a good and deeply profitable brand. And so, the stage is set. The sun has gone down on the last long day of October. The air is cold, and it smells of dead leaves and distant wood smoke. The world, for a single magical night, has been transformed. The familiar suburban streets are now a dark and mysterious landscape, lit by the grinning, demonic, and deeply welcoming glow of 100 jack-o'-lanterns. The veil, the old stories say, is at its thinnest. The world of the living and the world of the dead have drawn closer than at any other time of the year. And the monsters are walking among us. They are here. The witch, her silhouette sharp against the full moon, a ghost of a real and bloody history of persecution. The vampire, his cape a whisper of dark, seductive, and deeply forbidden desire. The zombie, a shambling, groaning, and deeply modern metaphor for our own mindless consumption. The ghost, the werewolf, the skeleton, the whole, unholy, and deeply beloved pantheon of our darkest and most enduring fears. They have left the pages of our books. They have stepped down from our movie screens, and they are here, now, walking our streets. But if you look closely, if you peer into the shadows beneath the pointed hat, if you look past the plastic fangs and the expertly applied fake blood, you will see the truth. The monsters are us. They are our children. They are our neighbors. They are ourselves. They are the faces that we have chosen for one single and deeply necessary night to wear. And this, in the end, is the final and most profound of all the mysteries. Why? Why do we do this? In our modern, rational, and largely secular world, a world that has, for the most part, abandoned the old, deep, and often very real fears of the supernatural, why do we continue to participate with such a deep and almost religious devotion in this strange and deeply pagan ritual? Why, every October 31st, do we still feel this primal and seemingly universal need to wear the masks of monsters and to willingly and even joyfully seek out the very things that we are supposed to be afraid of? The easy answer is that it is just for fun, that it is a holiday for children, a harmless and deeply commercialized excuse to dress up, to eat candy, to have a party. And on the surface, this is true, but it is not the whole truth. It is not even the most important part of it. Because beneath the bright, colourful, and often very silly plastic of the modern Halloween, there is something else at work. Something older, something deeper, something that is as ancient, as necessary, and as profoundly human as the fear of the dark itself. Halloween, in its purest and most essential form, is a ritual. It is a great and deeply cathartic communal ceremony, and its purpose is not to celebrate candy or costumes or parties. Its purpose is to confront and to ultimately to master our own deepest and most fundamental fear, the fear of death. We live our lives in a state of a profound and largely unspoken denial. We are all, every single one of us, carrying a secret and deeply inconvenient truth. The truth that our time on this earth is a finite and often tragically short affair. The truth that our bodies will one day fail, that our minds will one day cease to be, that everything we are, everything we love, will one day be taken from us by a force that we cannot see, cannot fight, and cannot in any way control. This is the great existential terror that hums quietly in the background of all our lives. And for 364 days of the year, we do everything in our power to ignore that hum. We distract ourselves with work, with love, with entertainment, with the small and often very loud dramas of our everyday lives. We build our lives, our societies, our very sense of self on the fragile and deeply necessary illusion that we are going to live forever. And then, for one night, for the night of Halloween, we do the opposite. We drop the illusion, we turn around, and we look directly into the face of the abyss. We invite the fear in. We give it a name. We give it a face. We give it a costume. We take all our free-floating and deeply formless anxieties about our own mortality, about the chaos of the universe, about the darkness that lies just beyond the edges of our own small and fragile lives, and we project them outwards onto these great and deeply satisfying archetypal figures. The witch, the vampire, the ghost, the skeleton. These monsters are the vessels for our fear. They are the containers that we have built to hold the things that are too large, too terrifying for our own individual minds to hold. And by giving our fear a face, by turning it into a character, into a story, we perform a profound and deeply empowering act of a psychological magic. We take an abstract and deeply internal terror, and we make it a concrete and external one. And once the monster is outside of us, once it has a face and a name, we can do something with it. We can fight it. We can laugh at it. We can, in the case of our children, dress up as it, and in doing so, we can, for a single magical night, become the thing that we are afraid of. This is the deep psychological genius of the Halloween costume. When a child puts on the mask of a monster, they are not just hiding their own face. They are taking control of the fear. They are no longer the small, helpless victim cowering in the dark. They are the monster. They are the thing that is doing the scaring. It is an act of a profound and deeply therapeutic empowerment. It is a way of learning to master one's own deepest fears by literally and playfully becoming them. And we, the adults, we participate in this ritual. We open our doors and we reward this act of monstrous transformation with a gift of candy, of sweetness. We are, in a sense, making an offering to the monsters, a symbolic and deeply ritualistic act of appeasement, a modern and deeply secular version of the old pagan practice of leaving a feast for the dead. We are acknowledging the power of the darkness, the power of the monster, and we are, through our small and deeply symbolic gift, asking it to be kind to us, to pass us by, to leave us in peace for another year. Halloween is the night when we, as a culture, perform a great and deeply necessary exorcism. But we are not exorcising the demons from our houses. We are exorcising them from ourselves. It is a form of a controlled and deeply consensual voluntary madness. For one night, we agree to suspend our disbelief. We agree to believe in ghosts. We agree to believe in monsters. We turn our own safe and familiar neighborhoods into a haunted landscape. We turn our own sweet and innocent children into a roving pack of ghouls and goblins. We do all of this because we know, on some deep and often unspoken level, that it is a necessary and deeply healthy thing to do. We need a night when we can confront the chaos, the darkness, the unknown, in a way that is safe, that is communal, and that is, in the end, fun. We need a night when we can laugh in the face of our own deepest and most profound of all fears. And so, the monsters endure. They are more than just the scary and often very silly mascots of a commercial holiday. They are a vital and deeply necessary part of our own human psychological immune system. They are the antibodies that we have created to fight off the far more dangerous and far more real infection of a constant and deeply paralyzing existential dread. The witch is our fear of the dark and often deeply persecuted wisdom of the outcast, the woman who lives outside the rules. The vampire is our fear and our desire of a love that is also a death, of a passion that is so powerful it consumes us. The zombie is our fear of a life without a soul, of a world where we are just a mindless and eternally hungry part of a great and deeply anonymous horde. The ghost is our fear and our hope that the past is never truly past, that the ones we have lost are still, somehow, with us. And the skeleton, the grim reaper, is our fear and our acceptance of the one great and final truth that binds us all together. These are not just monsters, they are a part of us. They are the dark and often deeply beautiful and deeply necessary stories that we tell ourselves in order to be able to live in a world that is so often a very, very scary place. They are the masks that we wear for one night in order to be able to see our own true and often very frightened human faces more clearly in the morning. And that is the final and most profound secret of the Halloween night. The monsters are not real, but the fear is. And the need to confront that fear, to give it a face, to laugh at it, to dance with it, and to ultimately to master it, is one of the most ancient and most deeply human of all our rituals. Halloween is the modern and often very strange and very beautiful ritual that keeps our ancient and very necessary fears alive. And as long as we are human, as long as we are mortal, as long as we are afraid of the dark, we will need our monsters, and they will be there, waiting for us, every October 31st, ready to be invited in, ready to be given a treat, and ready, in their own strange and deeply magical way, to save us from ourselves.